News 2 presents To The Point.
First point, a tragedy in Texas, reopening old wounds and reinvigorating old arguments. Gun control, now the talk of Washington. Break down how laws could change. Second point, here at home, lawmakers say metal detectors in schools could be a game changer in keeping students safe. We'll tell you the pros and cons of making these mandatory. And third point, a heated debate with a surprise concession. The GOP primary for the first congressional seat now down to just two candidates. We'll break down their platforms of Nancy Mace and Katie Harrington. Hello and thank you for joining us for To The Point. I'm Riley Benson, the show where we break down the political issues and elections that matter to you. I'll be joined by political analyst John Bersini to break down legislation being discussed at local, state, and the national level. A nation in mourning this week after a mass shooting at a Texas school. 19 elementary school students and two of their teachers dead in Uvalde, Texas. The alleged shooter killed in the aftermath was an 18-year-old named Salvador Ramos. This violence bringing us to our first point this morning. Reignited discussion about gun control in the wake of the national tragedy. Today, the President and First Lady will travel to Texas to meet with the families of those killed. Meanwhile, in Washington, the President asking questions that he says are on the minds of many.
Why are we willing to live with this carnage? Why do we keep letting this happen? These kinds of mass shootings never happen with the kind of frequency they happen in America. Why?
Shooting, the President has been pushing for new gun control laws and is finding mixed feelings from Republican lawmakers. Some saying we must ask the hard questions about guns, others saying the solution lies elsewhere.
We're going to try to work through this and see if we can find that common ground.
There's no doubt we need to do more to keep children in schools safe. We know from past experience that the most effective tool for keeping kids safe is armed law enforcement on the campus.
I want to bring in our political analyst, John Bersini, at this point. Now, John, the American people appear less divided than members of Congress at this point. A recent survey by NBC News says 88% of Americans want some kind of change, but obviously, you know, we see Congress has had some struggles meeting in the middle with this issue. Kind of talk to us about what you're seeing on the political level at the federal level.
Well, so certainly the polls indicate that the American public is more willing to accept different levels of gun control than what Congress right now seemingly is prepared to pass. Unfortunately, we've been here before, and we saw with Sandy Hook there were many outcries for some sort of change. Nothing really came of that, at least nothing meaningful. Yet here we are now with what happened in Texas, similar cries. It does seem that the tide might be turning slightly, where at least Republicans are open to a conversation on what change might look like.
And I guess, you know, what does that conversation look like? How does it start? Where do we begin?
Well, so it's certainly part of a larger conversation. In the clip, even Ted Cruz echoed the fact that we need to do more to keep kids safe in schools. What that looks like is probably some sort of combination of maybe gun control, some sort of mental health support. Again, there are several factors that need to be considered, debated, thoroughly, again, processed before we arrive to any type of, final conclusion.
And, you know, speaking of Senator Cruz, he is joining former President Trump and a number of other people meeting in Houston this week for some gun advocacy meetings. You know, what kind of a picture does that paint in the wake of this, you know, just hours away from where the shooting happened in Texas?
So that probably depends on what side of the aisle you lie on. If you are very pro-Second Amendment, very pro-gun, a member of the NRA, you definitely want them to show up, continue as business as normal in Houston. If you're someone, again, it's sad, but if you're a family member, who's maybe had an individual that's been lost to gun violence, so your perspective probably is a little bit different on whether that should still go on or not.
And John, we want to move on to our second point. It's something local here. We're going to get to it, and we're going to bring you in on this later. But our second point, a related issue, a low-country lawmaker is pushing for a bill that would put metal detectors in schools in South Carolina. When talking about walk-through metal detectors, Representative Wendell Gillard said in part, quote, "We use it at the State House, we have it at the governor's mansion, it's in our everyday lives," end quote. Representative Gillard believes it is better to have the metal detectors now rather than needing them later and not having them. And you know, John, we look at some schools across our state, some of the PD already have metal detectors in their schools. You know, where does this go? Do we think that this has any real traction in South Carolina?
So again, we've been here before. Representative Gillard certainly has brought this idea to the forefront in previous years. Here we are again talking about the subject. It's certainly a real possibility. Again, a lot of logistics to flush out there as far as, again, what schools need them, where do we put them, and to what effect does this have logistically on the schools during the day? Again, the kids have got to get inside the building. Do we now restrict general public to certain areas? Again, what exactly does this look like? I don't know if anyone knows right now.
You know, when you look at the Texas situation, and I think it's still early on in the information finding process, but the gunman went in through a back door of the school. Is there something else that, maybe alternatives that can be considered when you look at maybe different ways that, people enter buildings, and I guess the other question is, where's the funding come for something of putting metal detectors in every school in our state?
Sure. So certainly school districts in South Carolina, they vary depending on just how deep their budget is. Some of the smaller districts certainly couldn't afford to do really large sweeping changes. That money would have to come from the state. Nevertheless, it's sad, but it's just a fact of today's reality that schools do have policies and procedures set in place today for active shooters. For example, if you go to Wando High School, they have what they call the Welcome Center, which is basically a gate. They screen who comes and goes. If you're not on a list or if they're not expecting you, it's going to be difficult to get through to actually breach that gate to get to the campus.
It's certainly interesting to see where and if that goes anywhere coming up in the next legislative session. A Low-Country lawmaker is visiting an upstate New York community this week, more after a different mass shooting involving a teenager who killed 10 people at a grocery store. Representative J.A. Moore spent time at the memorial site, placing 10 palmetto roses to show support from the Low-Country community. Moore says Charleston and his family know the pain many are suffering all too well and knows it's important to be there for those dealing with loss.
We have to fight back like we've never fight back before. Only in this country do we get terrorized the way we do by guns. There's over 400 million guns in this country. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives are impacted every year by gun violence. We must do something, and we must do it now.
Representative Moore says he's partnered with local nonprofits in the area to provide free meals to those impacted in the Buffalo community. Now on to our third point. Federal prosecutors say they're stepping up their efforts to curb violent crime in South Carolina. Jason Raven sat down with U.S. Attorney for the District of South Carolina to talk about how they're looking to accomplish this.
Well, officials say there was no one specific event that led to this change in strategy, but rather a combination of documented events and the uptick in violent crime in South Carolina since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. U.S. Attorney for the District of South Carolina, Corey Ellis, says they're enhancing their violent crime reduction efforts and strengthening their work with state and local law enforcement. Their goal is to identify and disrupt those driving violent crime in South Carolina. The U.S. Attorney's Office says they will focus their efforts on those offenders who have recent violent felony or domestic violence convictions, have recently been released from state custody or were on state bond for a violent crime, have serious drug convictions, have ties to gang activity, or engage in trafficking firearms.
What we're trying to do is to hold ourselves accountable, and we're going to hold those who commit acts of violence accountable. But we're just the enforcement part of this story. And this is a story about our whole society. And it involves all community leaders, and all community leaders need to be part of the solution.
Ellis says they're meeting with law enforcement from across the state in the coming weeks to discuss this change in strategy. In Columbia, I'm Jason Raven.
Next on News 2.
Coming up, the debate stage becoming a spectacle after a surprise concession mid-argument. We're bringing the latest on the first congressional race right after this. News 2 is your local election headquarters. This week, 3 South Carolina 1st Congressional District opponents held a debate at Burke High School. News 2's Lexi Moore attended that very heated debate and tells us how the debate started off with a surprise.
What began as a debate of 3 ended up only 2.
And the way that I would earn the votes in this district would be by endorsing Katie Arrington for South Carolina District 1 for Congress.
The remaining contenders, incumbent Nancy Mace and Katie Arrington, going head-to-head to represent the people of South Carolina's 1st Congressional District. Mace defending her seat as Arrington points out what she sees as Mace's shortcomings.
I am the only Republican that can beat a Democrat today in these modern times. My opponent lost to a Democrat for the first time in 40 years, and I really truly understand low country values.
So Miss Mace, when she ran against Joe Cunningham and said, she was going to go up and be a fiscal conservative, and she talked about the penny plan, right? And she went up to Washington and she did exactly the opposite.
Both candidates touching on topics that are at the front mind of voters ahead of upcoming elections.
Right now we have crushing inflation that we need somebody in Washington who will actually do something about it. We have an energy crisis. Under President Trump, we had energy independence.
We're feeling the pain of inflation. She voted for that. I mean, she contributed to that particular issue, and I have a record of voting to lower taxes 100% of the time.
Mace highlighting some of the accomplishments she has made during her time in office in a highly partisan Washington.
I just secured over $50 million for the Low Country for stormwater and flooding issues throughout the Low Country, veterans issues and military issues.
But Arrington says that's still not enough.
We need somebody in Washington who's actually going to do their job and not just talk.
And John, obviously these two will go head-to-head in the primary election coming up on June 14th, but let's talk a little bit about this debate. Obviously things started off interesting. Linz Piper Loomis bowing out of this race, giving her support to Katie Arrington. I guess what does that say when you're a voter in this and you're considering who you want to vote for?
Well, Riley, for those of us who enjoy political theater, we are certainly getting our money's worth in the 1st Congressional Republican primary. Voters have got to remember, primary elections are different than general elections. In a primary election, candidates are trying to court the base. So if some of their policies and some of their remarks seem maybe a little more extreme or very partisan, very Republican, very Democrat, that's because of the demographic that they're going after. What we're seeing now, again, this is what we call in politics, just a street fight. Again, this is two individuals very passionate about their causes, very passionate about very passionate about the causes, very passionate about their side of the aisle and the issues that they support, and we're seeing this play out in real time.
Obviously we mentioned this is coming up just a few weeks from now. After this debate, both candidates or both, people running say that they were winners, both declaring themselves winners. What are some of your biggest takeaways from this? Who do you think won? Where do you think were some of the biggest wins for these candidates?
So certainly any issue that they view as scoring points for their side, they're going to view as being a win. At the end of the day, the only thing that really matters on the votes that are counted in the primary election, that's what's going to decide who faces the Democratic nominee in the November's election. So again, this will continue. It might even get a little bit worse leading up to the primary. Hard to believe that could happen, but certainly anything's possible. Again, folks, just buckle in. This is going to be a wild ride.
The other question, Congresswoman Mace has brought in the DOD issues that Katie Arrington is facing with her criminal clearance being, canceled a few years ago. How big of an issue do you expect that to become as we head down the road? Do you expect Congresswoman Mace to throw that in Arrington's face a lot, or what do we expect there?
So I certainly expect a lot of these issues to keep coming back up. They're going to use everything that they can to try to, number one, highlight a difference between each other, and then number two, also to give voters perhaps maybe some pause. Some folks, Arrington supporters, the hardcore Arrington supporters, that's not going to matter to them. They support Katie Arrington because whatever the reason may be. Same for Nancy Mace. Again, she's got a very strong base of support. It's those folks in between that might be swayed by something like a DOD clearance or how you voted on particular issues that really are going to decide that particular race.
In the background, Annie Andrews is obviously the Democratic candidate in this race. She kind of was very active on social media, kind of poking fun at this debate. Is that something you would expect from Annie Andrews in her Democratic, candidate run?
Absolutely. It was former Mayor Joe Riley used to say you either run scared or you run unopposed. If you run unopposed, it's great because basically you get to take advantage of everything that the opposite candidate has to go through in the primary election. So they can bring different issues up. They can use this as far as their campaign strategy looking forward. And it really doesn't cost them anything because they're not running against anyone else, at least right now. That changes once we get through the primaries, and then all of a sudden we look forward to November.
John, certainly interesting. We'll be keeping an eye on that as we head down the stretch towards that primary election on June 14th. South Carolina is finding ways to keep veterans in the Palmetto State. We'll tell you about the new benefits they'll have as the new bill is signed into law. Welcome back to The Point. You'll need to wait a little bit longer to get your name changed in South Carolina. As Jason Raven reports, lawmakers have added some new protections for some South Carolinians.
Well, this was one of the final bills to get across the finish line before the end of session this year. Now, H3271 received unanimous support in both the House and Senate. Well, the new law establishes a 6-month residency requirement for someone to petition for a name change. Before, officials say South Carolina was the only state in the Southeast without this requirement.
This was becoming a haven for people to come to the state, get their names changed, and then they could go about their business back out the state or wherever they want to go.
The bill's sponsor, Representative Rosalind Henderson Myers, says she drafted the bill after judges noticed an increase in the number of people applying for a name change. She says closing this loophole will prevent any bad actors from taking advantage of this.
I wanted to make sure that we weren't a magnet for those persons who might want to come in the state and for reasons that might not necessarily be honorable or justifiable, could get a name change and basically leave and have a new identity.
Now, there are exceptions for the 6-month residency requirement for victims of certain crimes. Under the new law, the courts can seal records to protect the petitioner if it's requested. Representative Henderson Myers says this just adds another layer of protection to victims of these crimes.
Victims of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, harassment, sexual offenses, trafficking in persons, and other types of abuse. We wanted those victims to be able to have a fresh start and have their identities, their new identities, kept secret.
Now, the governor signed the bill into law last week. In Columbia, I'm Jason Raven.
Our final point fitting for this Memorial Day weekend. State leaders say a new law that reduces the taxes for veterans will help vets return to the Palmetto State once their career in the military is over. The bill passed both the House and Senate unanimously and exempts all military retirement pay from being taxed by the state. Before, military retirees under the age of 65 were able to claim state tax exemptions up to $17,500. Retirees over 65 were able to claim an exemption of up to $30,000. The South Carolina Department of Veteran Affairs says this will attract more retired military to our state.
This really is about workforce enhancement and the development of a broader, larger pool of people either to return to, come to for the first time, or stay in if you're transitioning out of active duty while you're in service, to come to South Carolina, live, work, raise a family, and then, create a multi-generational set of citizens for us.
Now, John, obviously this is a big deal for veterans in South Carolina, but we were talking, this is kind of a bigger picture, a part of a bigger picture in our state for legislatives.
Certainly. So the General Assembly has been looking at ways to, number one, bring our veterans back to the state that are from here, and then certainly help to attract veterans that might not be from South Carolina back to the state. Again, this is a really good proposal for them. A lot of folks who do serve in the military get out, they're ready to start their second career, whether it be a small business or joining maybe a different type of workforce. Again, they're raising their families here. This is just, it's a good economic basis for the state across the board.
And do you expect this to be a game changer for veterans in South Carolina?
It certainly will be. If I were certainly in this group, I mean, it would cause me some pause and say, you want to know if I can save X amount of dollars by returning to South Carolina? Let's go ahead and do that. Again, the weather's beautiful. The food is great here in Charleston. Why not make this our home and grow from here?
Why not make this your home, right, John?
That's
Thank
right.
you so much for joining us this week on To The Point. And thank you for joining us for To The Point. We'll be back here every Sunday morning with the political stories that matter to you. Have a great rest of your weekend.